I'm now joined by Professor Sibusiso Bengu's former spokesperson, Lincoln Mali. Mr. Mali, a very good afternoon to you. Thanks very much for your time. I want to take you back to the early 90s. Professor Bengu appointed the first black chancellor of that historic institution, Fort Hare University. At about the same time, you had been, or just been, the vice president of SASCO, but also vice president of the National Education Coordinating Committee. Locate him in the conversations that had already been taking place at the time about the kind of tertiary education sector that our struggle heroes especially were trying to build, or at least talking about at the time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mvoko. Good afternoon to your viewers. In the early 90s, there was this tension between escalating the struggle and the education struggles in particular, yet at the same time start to think about what the future would hold if democracy were, to materialize in South Africa. And so what happened was that there were a number of conversations within the NECC and other structures to talk about how our institutions could be transformed. So colleagues that were in Fort Hare were involved in mass struggles there. There was a lot of tension, a lot of destabilization in that environment. And at that time, Professor Lamprecht was the last, vice chancellor of the old order, if you will, and there was now an acting, vice chancellor, Professor Gardner, and what then emerged was a process to appoint a new vice chancellor who would take Fort Hare, which is a very historic university, into the new democracy, and the name that emerged was Professor Sibusiso Bengu. And those of us who were exposed to his resume, who then got to be exposed to what he was doing from the people that were student leaders there, we were very impressed by the caliber of the person who has been an educationist from founding his own high school all the way to become a secretary, for the World Federation, Lutheran Federation in Geneva for 13 years. Here was somebody of high caliber becoming the first vice chancellor, of a transforming University of Fort Hare, in the first black vice chancellor of the University of Fort Hare. So very impressive times at the time, with people like Govan Begi in the council of the University of Fort Hare. So there's a lot of change that was taking place at the time.
Fast forward 4 or 5 years later, former President Nelson Mandela appoints him the first Minister of Education in a democratic South Africa. But almost as soon as he gets appointed, he gets to suffer this debilitating stroke.
Yeah, it's one of the things that when I look back at it now is one of the most fundamental things in my life and in my career, where I was recruited by this incredible man to become his spokesperson. After I'd accepted and everything had been done, I hear that he's got a stroke, and I've not even started my job. And as I start the job, every question I have to answer is, will he come back? Is he going to resign? Will President Mandela remove him or replace him? Is he the right person for the portfolio? And I get to then interact with this incredible man at the time when he is at his lowest. But that's when you found the fighting spirit in Professor Bengu, where he decided that he will fight through the stroke, and the support of his family and Mam Funeka and the kids were incredible. She changed everything, from his schedule to his diet to his exercise, and said, Umandla, as she would call him, Unulosi, will become better. And the moment when he spoke again in Parliament, his first press conference, his first meetings with us as a team, that was a triumph of an amazing man over adversity. And he was able to take on the task. And when you spoke to him, you understood that it was not about the position. It was about a sense of calling as to why he needed to do the task that he had been given.
So he comes out of having fought his way through the stroke. He gets to then, as you say, fulfill his duties and obligation. Earlier, Dr. Bladen Zimande, who was the chairperson of the Education Portfolio Committee at that time, was talking about his modesty, his humility, but the respect he commanded from everyone who interacted with him.
You know, Professor Bengu is the epitome of excellence through grace, through humility, through dignity. And this was somebody who didn't shout loud. He made his argument louder. He made his points louder by just the quality of his engagement. I just want to give you 3 examples of the difficulties that we faced and how he shone through those. The first one was there were 18 different departments of education. And his task was to create a single non-racial department of education and do that without disrupting the education system as it was. Whilst doing that, he had to create 9 new different provincial governments because there were no 9 provinces before 1994. At the same time, he had to create a new budget from the 18 different budgets. That's the first thing he had to do. The second thing he had to do was to put a policy framework. Education is one of the most emotive things. It affects every home, and every parent and everyone has got a view about where education should go. So he had to navigate to put the first policy paper, the first white paper in education, and the first National Policy Act. If you hear all of the debates that have been taking place about the Bella Act, you can go back to 1994 and see how magnified those debates were, with high levels of anxiety on one side of our community and high levels of expectations on the other. The third and probably profound thing was to try and build a civil service team made up of people from diverse backgrounds, people that were student activists, people that were academics, people that were in the old administration. So those were all of the things that he needed to do. And at the same time, put a policy framework for adult basic education, child education, further education, special needs education, tertiary education, vocational education, and things of that sort, putting a national qualification framework. All of those were foundational things that needed to be done. But if you look at the person, what we can take out of it, what I learned a lot from him about, it was never about him. It was always about the cause. So he didn't want to make himself the story. So many a times, journalists would come to me and say, we want to do a profile on Prof. And Prof would say, why? Profile a school, profile a university, profile a policy. Don't profile me, because it was never about me. It was about the cause he stood for. So he was an incredibly ethical man, very kind person. He taught us a lot of things. I am the person that I am because I kind of worked with somebody like that at a very, very young age. And so people like Tamim Seleku, myself, Nomusa Tube, and others grew in that office because we worked for somebody as special as that.
You talk about the person who didn't want to make himself the story. Senzo Mchunu earlier at that memorial service spoke about how his, as he put it, quiet actions spoke louder than words. You both reminding me of an incident when I had to write about his successor and compare his successor to him. And at the time, there were lots of controversies. And his late successor was at the center of it all. And the point that a lot of people kept on making was that it was not about his successor having or pursuing different policies to his, but the difference was that Bengu was a different person to his successor, which made him secure more victories than his successor was able to do at the moment. What would you say was the one thing about him that made him or that enabled him to navigate, stormy waters better than other people have managed to do, one would say, even since?
I think for me, Bengu was an educationist. His involvement in the whole struggle had to do with education. He believed in education. He was a teacher, I think, at the level at age 19 or something like that. He founded his own school, Langezwa High, which was renowned throughout the country for the quality of education it gave. He was a dean of students at the University of Zululand. He had already got a PhD in 1974. So this was somebody to whom education was not a political issue only. It was a fundamental issue. And so that's what it was always about to him. So he could relate to parents, he could relate to teachers, he could relate even to political parties that differed with him. People would write the most angry letters, and then he would invite them to come and meet him. And you would watch in awe how the tempers would go down. Student leaders who were militant would meet him and would be so frustrated because the man would be calm. He wouldn't delegitimize what they are saying, but he would give them a different perspective. That's just the way he was. And he trained us as a team to always treat every stakeholder as being important. We spent a lot of time, Sishila Sisulu, Tamim Seleku, and myself, meeting various stakeholders all the time, whether it be parliamentarians, whether it's the trade unions, whether it's parents' bodies, whether it's Africans bodies or universities, always hearing. When we were writing speeches for him, the speeches had to be balanced. The speeches had to be nuanced. The speeches had to be caring while still driving change, but not do it in a manner that was more disruptive. And I'll give you one maybe example, Vuyo, that maybe people that were not there in 1994 wouldn't understand how big the story was. That was the case of Reiterwag. So what happened was that there were a number of schools in former white areas where they were no longer having enough pupils, which meant that those schools were lying empty, and they were government schools, but they were in white communities. So the idea was that there was overcrowding in some townships. So the government would then bus those pupils into those communities so that they can learn. The similar thing to what was done in America. But it polarized people. The people at Reiterwag felt as if they were being attacked. Their community was being attacked. And the people in Khayelitsha and others felt that they deserved education. So you had these polarized opinions. But we navigated that thing because Prof felt that this is about education. Let's not make it a big political thing. Let's not judge others. And those children were able to go to that school. In the beginning, people were there with, baseball bats and everything, but the matter was quietened down. I'll also add that a lot of people talk about government of national unity and all of that today, but people forget that in Mandela's government, President Mandela's government, there was the president of the IFP, Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi from the IFP. There was Deputy President F.W. de Klerk. And the Deputy Minister of Education was Mr. Rinier Skuman from the Nationalist Party. And in the 9 provinces, there was a minister or an MEC, Mrs. Olcas, who was from the Nationalist Party. So making sure that education policy is inclusive meant that at all times you had to speak to your colleagues who were in cabinet to still drive your overall policy, so that you don't just simply say, I've changed this policy, but you have not taken people with you. There will always be different views about whether you're doing a good job or not. But at least what I loved about Ncolosi is that he couldn't be questioned about his intentions. He couldn't be questioned about his commitment and his honesty and transparency in changing education for education's sake, not for narrow political ends.
Mr. Lincoln Mali, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Voko. Appreciate it.